Here to Live and Now from Fox. I'm Andy Mack. Let's get to the top two stories in terms of politics here on this Thursday afternoon out of Washington, D.C., revolving around the current president, Joe Biden, and also the former president, Donald Trump. First, let's get out to the White House and current president, Joe Biden, as the special counsel, Robert Hur's office, releasing this special report talking about classified documents, saying that there will no charges recommended, no criminal charges, but they also found that President Biden, former President Biden, willfully retained some of those documents. They tweet right now from Fox's Mike Emanuel showing photos in a storage of in the Delaware garage of President Biden. Of course, we're going to follow this here on Live Now from Fox very, very closely. We want to follow it as we continue here on Live Now, and we want to bring in Neama Rahmani, a friend of the program, attorney. Thank you so much for joining us here on Live Now from Fox. And we hear that no criminal charges going to be recommended by the special counsel's 300 and some page document coming out. What's our biggest takeaway of this, Neama?
Well, it's a very damaging report for Joe Biden. And you're right, Andy, even though no charges were recommended, and frankly, he can't be charged because he's a sitting president. That's pretty well established. My two main takeaways, though, are that the special counsel found that President Biden acted willfully. So for us lawyers and under the law, that means on purpose. He purposely withheld the documents and disclosed classified information to a ghostwriter. So that's bad for the president. And probably the worst part is the special counsel's report talking about President Biden's significant memory issues. Couldn't even remember when his son passed away. And the report says that even if Biden were prosecuted, a jury might find him sympathetic because he's an elderly, well-meaning old man with memory issues.
Yeah, and of course they were kind of going back and forth. We heard statements coming out after this because talking about his poor maybe mental state as well. I do want to put up this tweet as well from Jackie Heinrich talking about this exact topic as Biden's lawyers wrote to her asking for them to reverse descriptions of the president's memory. Notably, their concern given the voter about his mental capacity, of course, saying your treatment of President Biden stands in marked contrast to the lack of comments about other individuals as well. Maybe how obviously they come out in this 300-page report and it's kind of the first thing people hear. So even if they do revise them, it might not change people's perspectives on it. But is this a likelihood? Is that possible that potentially the special counsel goes back and revises it, use the red pen a little bit, or is that out of the question?
It's possible, but very unlikely. I mean, the special counsel's commenting on the credibility and the veracity and the memory of the individual that's being investigated, the subject or the target of the investigation. So that's going to stay, even though it's not necessary. And the reason it's not necessary goes back to my earlier point. Biden can't be prosecuted right now. And as long as he's reelected, he can't be prosecuted. So, I think it's fair to really contrast this case to Donald Trump because people are saying there's a double standard in the Department of Justice. And what I will say as a former Department of Justice prosecutor is it's not really the memory issues that are the issue here, but really Biden cooperating with the Department of Justice and the National Archives, voluntarily giving those documents back, unlike Donald Trump that kept them for a year, forcing the referral to the Department of Justice, who issued a subpoena. Trump didn't fully comply with that subpoena, and of course, the search warrant was executed. So I think the cooperation is the important part, but certainly in an election year, folks that have concerns about President Biden's cognitive abilities, I mean, this is something that's a big problem for the campaign.
No criminal charges, but potentially politically damaging, to say the least, with some of these comments coming out from the special counsel, of course, trying to distance himself from this report, putting this special counsel in place. I do want to get into the fact that you mentioned the former president, Donald Trump, and I think a lot of people will compare and contrast these as well. And obviously, maybe it will take away from President Biden's ability to criticize the former president in an election year about this because he also willfully retained some. But you mentioned potentially the fact that he went along with prosecution. He interviewed just after the October 7th attack as well. Can we compare and contrast a little bit more of what's going on between Biden and Trump as well? Because Trump, he's federally potentially charged there, indicted with these different things revolving around obstruction as well. Can you contrast these a little bit more as well?
Sure. The big issue is that cooperation. So just taking a step back, these documents, they're not supposed to be in someone's private home or office. They're supposed to stay in the National Archives, or a SCIF, which is a secured facility. So neither Mar-a-Lago or Biden's Delaware home, they don't qualify. So the question is this, Donald Trump leaves office, and for more than 1 year, the National Archives, they're asking for Trump to return the documents. He doesn't do so. The archives say, well, if you don't, we're going to make a referral to the Department of Justice, because we know executive agencies, they can't enforce the law themselves. They need the DOJ to do so. So then the Department of Justice gets involved. They issue a subpoena. Trump, of course, the allegations are that he doesn't comply with that subpoena voluntarily. He turns over some documents, but not others, has some of them moved. And then, of course, there's that famous FBI search warrant that has to be executed at his home. So had Trump complied, I don't think he would be looking at any charges there in South Florida.
That is very, very interesting. Of course, that feels like almost a long time ago when that raid of Mar-a-Lago with those classified documents. Now the current president kind of in this as well. No charges filed. All right, let's get now into the former president, Donald Trump, as we're learning more about this new case there before the Supreme Court about the ballot ban. Of course, a live look just about 5 o'clock on the East Coast in Washington, D.C. And it was a hearing, certainly an unprecedented hearing on a possible Trump ballot ban. You were listening in today to some of this legal jargon, and it was quite an extended hearing between the justices and the lawyers as well. What was the maybe biggest takeaway, and what did we learn today from this?
Well, historic day, Andy, there in the Supreme Court. I mean, the 14th Amendment hasn't been litigated like this, if at all, since the Civil War. So legal historians and constitutional scholars like myself, we love it. But, Andy, my biggest takeaway is that Trump is going to win, and it's not a question of if, it's how he's going to win. I mean, he's going to win by a landslide. It may be 9-0 there in the Supreme Court or 8-1. Even the more liberal justices like Justice Jackson and Elena Kagan, had issue with the Colorado Supreme Court's ruling. And they said, well, how can one state make a decision like this? Isn't this something that Congress needs to address? And, going into this, we all knew that Trump had many paths to victory, but I think it's likely going to be procedural here as opposed to substantive. So I don't think the Supreme Court is going to come out and say that, January 6th, that was not an insurrection, or that Trump, even though it was an insurrection, he didn't engage in it. I think they're going to come up with some procedural off-ramp and say, the 14th Amendment, we know what it says, but it's not really appropriate for a state or a secretary of state to decide who's on the ballot and who's not.
And I think the term insurrection was brought up today, and just maybe the definition, the broad term of it. I believe the Chief Justice talked about maybe what is insurrection and what's a broad term of that as well. Can we get into maybe that just aspect of it, and that maybe how they define insurrection versus maybe a riot on January 6th? Is how much is that description, that give me different definitions impacting this as well?
Well, it may have an impact, and it was the Chief Justice, but also Justice Jackson. One of our last questions was, really, was this an insurrection? And of course, Trump's lawyers said it was a riot, and there was some back and forth. But really, if you're talking about the 2-hour oral argument, not much of it was spent on whether it was an insurrection or whether Trump engaged in it. We talked about whether the president is an officer. We talked about some old precedent discussing the 14th Amendment, whether this is going to disenfranchise voters. A lot more of the procedure than the substance. I thought really if we went into the substance and you see the justices talking about, January 6th and was it an insurrection and what's Trump's role in all of this, if the majority of the hearing and the oral arguments went on that, I would say, well, maybe these Colorado plaintiffs, they have a chance. But it was clear that not only just the conservative justices, but even the liberal ones had a real concern about an individual state deciding who's on the presidential ballot and who's not.
Yeah, no, obviously, I am not a person that listens into the Supreme Court very often. Obviously, the legal jargon, maybe a little bit over my head. But obviously, when you hear the line of questioning, how much can we read into that when, like you said, the different line of questioning from different justices you can kind of view what they maybe potentially will write about as well. Is that fair to say? Or the line of questioning, does that maybe a little bit, you can kind of tell where they lean either way?
You can, because let's not forget, most of these justices were, lawyers and law professors at some point. For instance, Justice Elena Kagan was my professor at Harvard Law School. So I remember her asking questions of me probably 25 years ago now. And usually you can get a sense of which direction they're leaning. And, if they're talking about questions that might favor Trump's lawyers and they're going in that direction, right? So you saw Justice Jackson, right? She's talking about, is the office of presidency is not even a federal officer for the purpose of the amendment. And that was Trump's first argument, and something that the Colorado District Court, the trial court, that's something that the judge found that procedurally, the 14th Amendment doesn't even apply to the president. So, regardless of whether there's an insurrection or not, it doesn't even apply. So you saw some of the justices focused on that, or really, you saw Justice Roberts or Justice Kagan, they're talking about, well, isn't the 14th Amendment supposed to give power to the federal government to prevent states from putting forth individuals who are insurrectionists? This is really doing the opposite. You're giving power to the states, and a small majority of people in the states might be able to keep someone off the ballot. And is this going to be a tit for tat situation where red states and secretaries of states there and attorney generals are going to keep Joe Biden off the ballot? How does any of this make sense? Let's decide this at the ballot box and not with elected secretary of states or unelected judges.
That is a very good point. I do want to get into the fact that potentially, obviously, a decision could be coming very, very quickly as well. But they also talked about maybe that Congress needs to pass a law, or that he needs to be convicted first as well. Could they maybe pass the buck a little bit in this regard, in their opinion of this, maybe pushing it on to Congress to saying that a law needs to be passed first for potentially this to happen, or that he needs to be convicted first? Is that something that could happen?
Yes, and I think the opinion may really push this on Congress. And you saw Justice Kavanaugh ask questions about this old Griffin decision. It wasn't a Supreme Court decision at the time, but the judge eventually made its way to the Supreme Court and became the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And in that case, decided a year after the 14th Amendment, the judge said, well, this is something that Congress needs to pass a law to decide how the 14th Amendment is actually implemented. And, we all know what it says. The question is it self-executing? Is it a Secretary of State? Is it some other state official? Or really, is it Congress that needs to decide, who is an insurrectionist? And then one of the other issues is the due process that we've talked about. Is it appropriate for someone to be deemed an insurrectionist without being charged, without being convicted? Because we know, despite all of Trump's many legal problems, he's never been charged with insurrection. And to the extent that he was impeached, he was acquitted by the Senate. So these are all due process procedural concerns that the judges have. How can one low-level state court judge decide to keep a major party candidate off the presidential ballot?
And this all comes just hours away from the Nevada GOP caucus coming a little later tonight. We'll have you covered on that as well. And, of course, almost the presumptive nominee on the GOP side. And the Supreme Court doesn't necessarily move at the quickest pace, but they are moving at an expedited pace right now. How soon could we see, and maybe is this an unprecedented kind of rapid nature of a decision that will come out from them?
It really is, Andy, and you said it. This is the fastest the Supreme Court has really ever moved, at least in my lifetime. So if you're reading the tea leaves, that means that they're going to reverse the Colorado Supreme Court's decision. Because had this appeal been processed in the normal course, it wouldn't have been heard this quickly, and probably not even this term, which means that it would have been heard after the November 2024 general election, which, of course, would be too late. So the fact that the justices agreed to take this case, agreed to expedite briefing and oral arguments, leads me to believe that we're probably going to get a decision in a matter of weeks. We're probably not going to have to wait till the end of the court's term, which usually the big decisions come out in June.
All right, that is a good insight there. Neama, Rahmani, thank you again for joining us. These were two major cases that we're following, including the special counsel report and this SCOTUS potentially decision coming soon. Thank you again for joining us here on Live Now from Fox. Great insight.
Thanks for having me, Andy, as always.
All right, thank you so much.